Hi. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on a small team at Twitter that's been building our next generation web app design and development platform. Internally, it's known as Responsive Web, and it powers Twitter Lite, which we kind of announced last month. So today I'm going to share why Twitter Lite exists, how we're building it, and the results that we're seeing. And to round things off, I'll share a few of my thoughts about the future of progressive web apps and what React frameworks on the web might look like. So one of the main reasons that I joined Twitter was because I believed it could be a platform that not only connects people to what they care about, but exposes us to more of the complexity of the world and the different ways of being a human being. Twitter has 10 core values, and the one that resonates with me the most is reach every person on the planet. That's not reach every Westerner on the planet, it's not reach every monetizable user on the planet, it's reach every person on the planet. And reaching every person on the planet is a challenge because the internet today is still slow, unreliable, and expensive for billions of people. Research aggregated at Twitter indicates that over 1 billion people can only connect at 2G speeds. Over 50% of people experience speeds that are a generation behind the advertised connection that they're being marketed. So 4G users experience 3G speeds, 3G users experience 2G speeds. Furthermore, around 1.8 billion people cannot afford 500 megabytes of data a month. And devices in Europe, the United States, and Japan tend to be significantly more capable than those used in the rest of the world. So most of the devices have slower CPUs, less storage, less memory than many of you will be familiar with. So designing for fast, cheap, reliable networks and powerful devices is a recipe for exclusion and limited product growth, whereas designing for slow, expensive, and unreliable networks, as well as low-powered devices and limited battery life, ultimately benefits all users and ensures that we can reach the largest possible audience. And this is particularly important as making people feel noticed, connected to the world, and empathized with is step one in building a product that they can enjoy and use regularly. So as billions of people come online in the coming years, being able to reach them and being able to adapt our product to include this richer and more complex humanity is both business critical and a moral imperative for a network like Twitter. So overcoming these challenges involves us developing effective ways of working together. And today, the Responsive Web team is multidisciplinary and responsible for the entire product. Our product development principles are based on, or focused on, people and fast iteration cycles, so we can adapt as we learn. And we look to prioritize high-impact work and incremental delivery via daily deploys. So we think, how can we add value at every stage? How can we keep our options open and rapidly make the most of known and emergent opportunities? And so you can experience the result of our work so far in Twitter Lite, which is a progressive web app available at mobiletwitter.com. So before I go into how we work and how we built Twitter Lite, let me share some of the results so far. So Twitter Lite has enormous reach, and so does the mobile web. It has massive year-over-year growth in page views and a 20% decrease in bounce rate relative to our previous app. When we include logged-in traffic, it has 50% more unique visitors per month than desktop web does. Twitter Lite also has outstanding cost efficiency for users and for Twitter. The download of the app itself is well under a megabyte, most of which is done in the background after tweets have been rendered on screen. We use less data by default, and with data saver mode enabled, it saves even more. Whereas desktop web is one of the world's largest JVM apps, Twitter Lite relies on a really small Node.js server. And it does so little that running Twitter Lite in our data centers for an entire year incurs lower compute costs than desktop web racks up for an entire month, in 1 month. So as a wise man once said, efficiency is intelligent laziness, and we simply do less on the back end. While this isn't an apples to apples comparison, it gives you a sense of the reach and efficiency of mobile web and Twitter Lite. Twitter Lite has also driven huge increases in engagement compared to our previous mobile website, and in just the last 6 months of improvements we've made to Twitter Lite itself, we've seen an 85% increase in visits to the home timeline, an 80% increase in original tweets sent from the app, over 1 million app launches a day from the home screen, and just 1 month after launching push notifications, we're sending over 10 million pushes a day. So what's really encouraging is the enthusiastic reactions from people using Twitter on 2G networks in countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, and Nigeria. These kind of reactions are really what it's all about for me. And so a cornerstone of Twitter Lite and the results that we've seen so far has been our focus on performance and on expanding our conception of what performance really means. So performance is not just a feature, it's a foundational feature. And at a deeper level, performance is part of a fundamental availability of a digital product. So can people even use your product? Does it fit on their device? Does it work when the network's unavailable? Does it work where they are? Can they even perceive content? For example, is it localized in their language? And is it accessible to people experiencing temporary or permanent impairment of vision, dexterity, and so on? Another area in which our thinking has evolved as we developed Twitter Lite is the idea of designing for failure. So when a network is unreliable, it can cause API requests or entire script downloads to fail. And previously, users would be left in an unrecoverable state. And so what we started to do was detect when scripts failed to load, when API requests failed, and we would inform users of a problem and provide them with a means to initiate a retry and recover from that state. But even when there isn't a failure, the network itself might be slow and the device underpowered. So to mitigate this, we progressively load and render content, and this helps us get off the network and get off the main thread. Since the human perception of time itself is malleable and contextual, showing indicators of progress at the right times can also improve the perception of performance. So as you can see in the last two screenshots here, one of the ways in which we get content onto the screen faster is to defer image loading to an idle period, and we use the request idle callback API to do this. This is something that's baked into our image component, which is lifted out of React Native for web. So our focus is really on getting to this fully interactive state at the end as quickly as possible. And Webpack's code splitting functionality helps us do that. We can slice the app up and pick just the amount of script that we can get away with to load the home timeline. And then after that's happened, we delay by about 10 seconds the prefetching of the entire app. And that allows us to prioritize the on-screen network requests and delay these kind of like future navigations. So as I mentioned earlier, 1.8 billion people can't afford 500 gigabytes of data a month. But historically, Twitter's been a product that by itself, you could easily blow through tens of megabytes of data in a single day of moderate to heavy use. Even in some of our largest and best connected markets, we see usage trends correlate with monthly data plan renewals. So intelligently managing data consumption is a necessity for billions of people. We try to help people deal with this data constraint by serving smaller media resources by default and relying on cached data when we can, which also helps the browser do less work. The data saver feature is something that we designed and developed within our team in just a couple of weeks, and it dramatically reduces data usage even more. When enabled, images and video previews are hidden behind this blurry preview image, and we display the size of the asset and give users a button in which they can decide for themselves if they want to download that content. In the coming weeks, we'll be shipping further improvements to that reduce the size of these image previews by another 8 to 10 times, using 1 kilobyte or even half kilobyte preview images in Chrome using WebP. So overall, this can result in hundreds of times less media-related download costs and puts control of downloads into the user's hands. So one of the most important tools that we have for performance engineering is actually measuring timings in production. This is the only way we can really get visibility into how the diversity of devices and network types impact the speed of the overall user experience. So we record timings for render, initial interactivity, when the first tweet was rendered, as well as estimates for the mount and update times of some of our key React components, like the timeline and the tweet. So these graphs also give us a breakdown and show us the bounds within the 50%, 95%, and 90% of timings. So what we try and do is reduce the space between the 50% and the 99% to be as narrow as possible, as this indicates that we're covering the widest possible range of network situations and device performance. So I want to mention in passing that we don't do any server-side rendering for our React screens. As I mentioned before, we're really focused on time to interactivity and getting that first tweet on the screen. And having inert content on the screen is not a good user experience for Twitter. Furthermore, the majority of our visitors are repeat visitors, which means that most users of progressive web app-enabled browsers are loading data from the cache and fetching API data and fetching direct data directly from the API, rather than requesting HTML from our Node.js server. In fact, we replaced a server-side rendered logged out app with Twitter Lite and saw a substantial increase in page views and time spent in the app. So rendering React trees for us is not where there's the most value, and it would also increase those really low compute costs that I showed earlier. So far I've discussed how critical performance and availability is, and the key role of availability and accessibility in building a product that's inclusive. And part of what's allowed us to focus so much time on this kind of thinking on performance and accessibility is that we have a fantastic design system that we've developed over the years with our partners in the design team. So when we first started thinking about rebuilding our mobile website, the team was only 3 engineers and 2 designers. And beginning with such a significant amount of design involvement has allowed us to introduce component-based thinking to both our design and engineering teams, as well as develop a shared language. And this common domain-specific language that we have at Twitter that is shared by both designers and engineers allows us to move more quickly and with more confidence that we're talking about the same things. So our design specs tend to look a bit like this. They avoid specific lengths and hex values, and instead of referring to a specific number of fixed sizes and a predefined color palette. And in many cases, the specs themselves simply refer to a component name, and they don't really include any real UI detail because we already know what that component looks like. And this allows us to quickly compose and create new UI and screens. So we still have a lot of work to do to better surface this design system to engineers and designers rather than it kind of being hidden away inside the code base. But it's still been central to performance, accessibility, and some of the other things that I'll talk about in a moment. So we rely heavily on Flexbox for layout as well as part of this design system. And we use CSS modules at the moment to better isolate our styles. I think this component-based approach and a coherent design system limits the amount of CSS that we write by design. And this combination of factors means that we don't think so much about CSS maintainability or CSS architecture, and we can focus more directly on user problems. React Native was also released while we were developing this mobile web app. And I created early versions, web versions, of the text, view, and image primitives to use in Twitter Lite, as I thought that these building blocks were flexible and higher level than the web DOM primitives. And they can be good building blocks for building any user interfaces, not just native apps. And that was at the time when I basically started working on React Native for web as well. So design systems and better primitives help us maintain iteration speed. And despite everything I've said about performance, I think that maintaining iteration speed is more valuable over the long term than squeezing absolute maximum performance out of your application. So one of the most important qualities of any self-adjusting system is being able to adapt to the edge of chaos. You have to be able to adapt within a limited time frame. And anything that negatively affects your ability to adapt is a critical problem. So when we look back, all we see is what survived. So the fact that we're here at all is a good sign. But you can safely assume that if someone or something else can adapt faster than you, that might turn out to be bad for you, which is why iteration speed and adaptation are more important than absolute performance. So eventually, any stabilized relationship between a system and its environment is going to disintegrate as problems inherent in that arrangement become apparent. In the case of app development, as new apps and new paradigms make their way into people's hands, their feelings towards and expectations towards your app are also going to change. So we need strategies to deal with this constant change. And a key part of that is understanding what constitutes hard problems and what parts of the application are likely to change frequently. Those parts of the app that are going to change frequently are better off isolated from the rest of your code so that they can be changed and removed while minimizing significant disruption elsewhere. And I really like this idea that I first read about on Programming is Terrible, which is that rather than focusing on reusable software, we should be writing disposable software. That good code is code that's easy to delete. So continuing with this theme about how we work on Twitter Lite and the ways that we're thinking about things, while iteration speed is critical and important, and adapting to change is the only way that you can make sure that you're still going to be around, dealing all of this requires a commitment to continuous learning and to developing responses to the inevitability of failure. So we all fail, and it's usually unexpected, and it can be incredibly difficult to face failure and to face your own mistakes. But learning from failure is also incredibly important. This concept of resilience is about the speed and strength of your response to these failures and to adversity. And it's something that you can develop in yourself and in your team and ensure that people feel noticed, that they feel cared about, that they feel relied upon, and that they feel that they matter. Because it's when you fail that all this time that you've spent and invested in learning, and that you've invested in your colleagues, and that you've invested in your relationships, both in work and outside of work, really pay off. But in all these areas, technical performance, iteration speed, learning, dealing with failure, there's a difference between the concept and the experience itself. So when we're learning something new, we may understand it conceptually and intellectually, but it doesn't necessarily influence or change our behavior. It's not enough to just understand the idea. It is through practice and with time that there's a deepening of experience. Those, oh, now I get it, moments, that's not just an idea, that's an experience. And I once heard this described as like the penny dropping, but it's like a penny dropping down a bottomless well. So you never really stop having these moments, but they only occur through continued practice and through experience and through being open to learning. Part of remaining in this beginner's mind space is developing an awareness of your assumptions and an awareness of the assumptions that are baked into your company and your team. Because it's impossible to be free of assumption, but what we can do is develop the skill to improve our awareness of when we make assumptions and where we make them. And when we're aware of an assumption, our mind becomes more open to thinking differently, and sometimes that's all it takes to make progress and to understand different perspectives. So fundamentally, like all of this process of learning, this process of discovery, it should be fun. You should be curious and learning new things, working with people and discovering things together. And I think it's important to remember that tools like Webpack, React, and React Native and so on are tools that we currently use to achieve specific outcomes. While the tools themselves are important, they're less important than the ways of thinking and working and of staying motivated. So one of the things that I find really enjoyable about the web at the moment and working at Twitter is that the future looks like one of opportunity and of new possibilities. So I've talked about why we're building Twitter Lite, how it's being received, and what we're focusing on, and the way that we work. And I'd like to share a bit, some of my thoughts on the future of web apps, and what it might mean for Twitter Lite. Hopefully you'll see that our small team and this new product is well positioned to take advantage of many of these new opportunities. So one of the first things that I think is going to happen is that web apps are going to end up everywhere. At the moment, we're used to accessing them from our browser and maybe using the add to home screen prompt. But they're going to start moving beyond the browser. We're still in this like early adopter phase, both as an industry and as users. And as Brent said, while many of you might be fans of progressive web apps, even of Twitter Lite, there are probably few of you that switched over to using them or incorporating them into the way that you interact with businesses. And I think that will start to change as companies like Microsoft, as they announced recently, begin to start adding progressive web apps to the Windows Store, for example, automatically. You won't even need to register your own app. They're going to just be crawling the internet and converting them into APKs, X's. And similarly, Google announced at I/O that progressive web apps installed to the home screen on Android will generate a small APK, allowing progressive web apps to appear in the app drawer alongside other apps in the OS settings as well. So here you can see what it feels like to add to home screen in this new enhanced experience. You'll get like some kind of status indicator that the app is being installed. And here it is like in the app drawer alongside the main Twitter app. And when you're a user and you go into the like app settings, you'll see that the progressive web apps themselves, their launchers are absolutely tiny. It's 140 kilobytes next to the amount of space that Twitter for Android takes up, which is closer to 90 megabytes. So when progressive web apps end up being distributed like this, people are going to be able to access lightweight, easy to install apps and have the largest distribution of any app platform. This is going to be a huge advantage and a unique differentiator, and it's something that we need to capitalize on because that's going to be one of the unique separating things that separates web apps from native apps. So even if there are some UX details and flourishes that are still beyond the web platform today, it has these incredible strengths that it's absolutely critical to double down on and to surface to users as the reason that they would want to use these apps. And so as progressive web apps make their way into app drawers and app stores, users are going to start to have a difficult time finding out what the difference is between like a native app and a web app. They're not going to know how an app is built. They're only going to know what it feels like to use it and whether it fits well into their life. So overall, I think this points to the web platform becoming a default choice for many app developers, especially at smaller companies. You'll be able to reach all platforms, all operating systems, all devices, including those that you've never even heard of and that haven't even been created yet, such as the power of the web. You'll be able to reach all form factors and respond to all different types of user inputs. You'll be able to deploy when you want, and you'll be able to reach users on their terms and in a manner that respects their constraints and needs. The last thing I want to talk about this kind of future thing is React Native, but for the web, which might sound like a strange concept. I think React Native itself has been blurring the lines between web and native apps. It's been introducing many web developers to native development and introducing many native developers to some of the benefits of building on top of web technologies. So I've been working on a web implementation of React Native for probably about a couple of years now. And much of that has found its way back into Twitter Lite. We use components like view and text and image and switch and several of the React Native APIs like the netinfo API. And we're currently experimenting with introducing React Native Stylesheet API, or the web implementation of it, onto Twitter Lite. So Twitter Lite, as I have mentioned, has incredibly aggressive global performance requirements, which makes it very challenging to push more work into JavaScript. But the early results are encouraging and kind of make me think that it's worth continuing to invest in this area. Certainly, I think if you don't have quite as aggressive performance requirements, it's an interesting thing to look at. And given the advantages of many of the progressive web apps and many of these use cases, I think we'll start to see more efforts that will allow React Native to target progressive web apps, not just Android and iOS, and more teams finding that React Native provides good building blocks simply for building progressive web apps themselves. So thank you for listening to everything I had to say. I also want to thank many of the people at Twitter who are working in design, on desktop web, on web tools, on the Android app, on the iOS app, from whom we've borrowed many architectural ideas and who have been big supporters of mobile web. And those working on platform and performance infrastructure at Twitter that are helping us deliver on the mission of mobile Twitter.com and Twitter Lite. These efforts are impossible. It's really impossible to kind of communicate just how many people are involved in making something like this happen, and just how much work you depend on that is invisible to you, that was maybe written by people, code that was written by people years ago. It really is like an enormous effort to make something like this happen. Finally, I want to thank the responsive web team themselves. These are all the people who are working on Twitter Lite and making it happen. Thank you.